Hello, my name is Suyan Somnorine, and I'm an instructor here at Ultimate Medical Academy, here with a lesson to help you with this week's content.
All right, so let's begin with the respiratory system. In this lesson, we're going to be describing and also going over some of the functions of the respiratory system. Two main functions of the respiratory system. One of them is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the outside air and the internal bloodstream that is passing through the lungs. And we also have the production of sound. And this comes from the air being exhaled from the lungs, passing through the larynx, making the production of sound. Now, respiration is divided into external respiration, internal respiration, and cellular respiration. We will see further on in the lesson. So basically, external respiration is called breathing or ventilation. And this has to do with the exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide between the lungs and the environment. Inspiration, breathing in, expiration, breathing out. Internal respiration, this happens between the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, but at the cellular level. In cellular respiration, this is also known as oxidation, which is the use of oxygen to release the stored glucose, and the cells do this in order to make energy. All right, so here's a diagram showing the three types of respiration, starting with the external respiration, which occurs between the environment and the lungs. So up here, we see the air being sucked in, taking it into the lungs here within the alveoli. And the alveoli, as we will learn later on, is composed of capillaries. And here's where we have the exchange of carbon dioxide for oxygen. So this is external respiration, we exhale. Then we move on into internal respiration, where again we have the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen within the tissue cells. Starting over with the respiratory organs and structures, we have the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi. So let's get started with the respiratory organs and structures. Again, starting here with the nasal cavity, and we will cover these in more detail in the coming slides. We have the pharynx, which is the throat. The larynx is known as the voice box. The trachea is your windpipe, and the bronchi, these are the branches of the windpipe leading into each of the lungs. We also have the bronchioles, which are smaller tubes or smaller subdivisions of the bronchi. Your alveoli are sacs of capillaries that allow one to pick up oxygen. We have the lungs. These are the stars of the system, and we will be talking about them shortly. The pleura, that's the membrane that surrounds the lungs. The diaphragm, that's the muscle that separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity. And this muscle actually does help us in respiration. The mediastinum, that is the space that is found between your lungs. And here we are, the external respiration pathway. Looking at the structures of the respiratory system, starting here with the nasal cavity. And this is where the air comes in and gets warmed up and moistened. And then we enter the larynx. Now the larynx is divided into the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Then the air moves in, down through the trachea, into the primary bronchi, separating into the secondary bronchi, leading here to the end. And in the end, here's where we have the alveoli and the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The nasal cavity. This is ideally where air comes from outside, enters the system through the nostrils. They're also called external nares entering the nasal cavity. The nares are separated by the nasal septum. The turbinates, or the nasal conchae, further divide the nasal cavity into passageways. And what this does, it increases the surface area of your nose, adding moisture to the air, filtering the air from dust and dirt particles. And the whole nasal cavity is lined with mucous membranes that help to trap dirt and dust that we breathe in. Within the turbinates, the air is warmed before entering the lungs. And we also have cilia. What is cilia? Cilia are basically little tiny hairs that line our nasal cavity, as well as the pharynx and the trachea. And the cilia, again, these are these small hairs, and what they help do is they help to further filter the air by trapping larger dirt particles. By the time that the air reaches the lungs, the air is warmed, it's moistened, it's filtered from any dust particles. And on the upper part of the nasal cavity, you also have your olfactory nerves, which provide your sense of smell. Your sinuses, these are the cavities within the skull, which basically help to lighten the load of your skull. And these also contain mucous membranes, which assist in warming the air as it's coming in through the nasal cavity. Next is the pharynx. The pharynx is also known as your throat. It is a common passageway for both food and air, and is divided into three sections. We have the nasopharynx, which is located directly posterior to the nasal cavity. So here's where we have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx that is found directly right behind your throat, or right behind your mouth, actually. So at the back of the mouth, that is known as the oropharynx. And then moving a little bit down, there we have the laryngopharynx. Next is the epiglottis. Now, the epiglottis is a flap of tissue, and what this does, it helps to cover the trachea as we swallow. If we are swallowing, if we're drinking, if we are eating, then the epiglottis, what it does, okay, let's pretend that this is the trachea, the tube that is leading down to the lungs, and this is the epiglottis. So as I am eating, as I am drinking, the epiglottis basically covers the trachea so that the food particles or the water particles that we are eating and drinking go down through the esophagus instead of going down into the trachea and making us choke. So again, this is the epiglottis, which is just a flappy piece of tissue, and it covers the opening of the trachea when we take in food or when we are drinking. The larynx. The larynx is also known as the voice box, and the wall is composed of 9 fibrocartilaginous plates. The largest of these plates is what is known as the Adam's apple. In males during puberty, the plates also grow, making the Adam's apple more prominent. And so let's look at the diagram here of the larynx. Okay, so here, just a closer look. Here we have the larynx. This is a top view of the larynx. And here's where we have the vocal cords. This is not like a real life illustration, but you can kind of think as the vocal cords, kind of like the string on a violin, and that's essentially how they look like. So as the air is passing through here, up the trachea, passing through the vocal cords, that helps to produce the sound of voice. And remember here about what I said about the epiglottis. Again, here the epiglottis right up here would cover the top of the trachea when we are taking in food and when we are taking in water. So over here we also have the vocal cords as they are inside of the larynx. Here's your trachea, and your vocal cords are located here. Mucous membranes also line your entire larynx area, and the glottis, this is also just another name for epiglottis. The trachea. The trachea extends down from the larynx in front of the esophagus and forms the two bronchs as we see here. Let me take my cursor so you can see here. So here's the trachea, and then once here, then we have the division of the primary bronchs. Now the walls of the trachea is made up of C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. That basically what this does, it helps your trachea to keep open for passage of oxygen, and it also keeps it as non-collapsible. So it's a non-collapsible tube because of the C-shaped hyaline cartilage that is lining the trachea. The bronchi and the bronchioles. This is where the lower end of the trachea separates into the right and left bronchus, leading into each the right and left lungs. The bronchs are similar in structure to the trachea. At the end of each bronchiole are the small sac-like clusters called the alveoli. The alveoli. The alveoli are sacs of single-layered epithelial tissue. It's surrounded by a bed of capillaries, and it also has surfactant. And this is where we have the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So this is where it takes place. An adult lung has about 500 million alveoli. This is about the 3 times the amount that is necessary to sustain life. The inner surfaces are covered with a lipid material called surfactant. What does surfactant do? The surfactant helps to stabilize the alveoli, preventing their collapse. So in each alveolus is enclosed by a network of blood capillaries, and this is again where we have the exchange of carbon dioxide for oxygen. The lungs. The lungs is separated by the mediastinum and the heart. Looking at here, we have the right lung, which is made up of the upper lobe, the middle lobe, and the lower lobe. On the left side, we have the left lung, which only consists of the upper lobe and lower lobe. So right in between here, this space is referred to as the mediastinum. You see how the left lung here has a concave space. This is due to the heart. This is where your heart would be, and the apex of the heart leans here towards the left. So that's why the left lung is essentially smaller than the right lung. So the apex is found at the top of each lung. The broad lower part is referred to as the base. So down here is the base, up here is the apex portion of your lungs. At the base, rests over the diaphragm. So down here is the base of the lungs. So down here, where my cursor is where you have the diaphragm, and the lungs essentially rest upon it. The right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes, again due to the position of the heart. Pleura. Pleura is a thin, moist, slippery membrane of tough endothelial cells that cover the lungs. Pleural fluid is a serous fluid that is found between the pleural membranes, and this fluid is necessary to prevent friction between the membranes as we are inhaling and exhaling. Now, when there is an increase in pleural fluid, this can be dangerous since it can cause difficulty breathing, and it can also cause the lungs to collapse. The excess fluid is removed by thoracentesis. So thoracentesis is a procedure that involves inserting a hollow tube-like instrument to drain out the excess fluid. Pneumothorax, this is a condition that occurs when there's a buildup of air within the pleural cavity on one side of the chest. This can actually cause the lung to collapse, which one will be unable to breathe. However, the other lung can still function and can still breathe. Pleurisy, that is the inflammation of the pleura, which is the sac that encloses the lung. The diaphragm. The diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle between the abdomen and the thorax. It contracts and relaxes along with the intercostal muscles that make breathing possible. Your intercostal muscles, those are the muscles that is found between your ribs. The phrenic nerve, this comes from the brain all the way down, inserting itself into the diaphragm, and the phrenic nerve is what helps to stimulate the diaphragm to contract. So here we have a picture of the diaphragm, and remember here we would have the right lung and the left lung that is resting on top of the diaphragm. Mediastinum. This is also called the interpleural space. It's located between the lungs and it contains the thoracic viscera. Mechanism of breathing. The exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide, this is known as breathing. We have pulmonary ventilation, which is called breathing as well. And again, pulmonary ventilation, it just involves the lungs. Due to changes in pressure that occur within the chest cavity, this enables for oxygen to enter through our nasal cavity, moving down through the trachea and entering the lungs. Variation in pressure caused by cellular respiration and mechanical breathing movements. The mechanical breathing movements, this is where the diaphragm comes in, and we will look at it more closely in the next slide. But let's look at some of the breathing mechanism as it occurs here. So when you breathe in, air is drawn in, passing through the trachea into the lungs, and when you're taking in air, your lungs expand. As your lungs expand, the diaphragm moves down. So as the diaphragm is pulling, it's essentially pulling your lungs down, and this helps to increase the surface area. So that's what allows the air to rush in as you are breathing in, which also allows the lungs to expand, diaphragm pulling the lungs down. The breathing process. So during inspiration, or as we take in the air, the external intercostal lifts the ribs upward and outward. And again, this makes room for your lungs to expand. We have the diaphragm moving down, and the air pressure decreases, resulting in air moving into the lungs. What this does, as the diaphragm pulls down on the lungs, the air pressure decreases within your lungs. So the air pressure is low in the lungs, but is high externally. So in your external environment, we have high air pressure. In the lungs, we have low air pressure as the diaphragm is moving the lungs down. So the diaphragm moves the lungs down, decreasing the air pressure. And just like all molecules, they don't like to be crowded. So they move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So this is what allows the air to enter our nasal cavity, moving down into the lungs. During expiration, or as we breathe out, exhalation, air increases within the chest cavity. Because remember, we just had that rush in of air that came in through the nasal cavity, filling our lungs. Our lungs are filled. We have gathered up all the oxygen to oxygenate the blood that is passing through, and then we exhale, because as we hold in our breath, the air pressure inside of our lungs increases. So then what happens during exhalation? So the diaphragm pushes back up, so it pushes the lungs back up. thus kind of increasing the air pressure, so it kind of rushes all the air out. So that is the breathing process. Diaphragm pulls down on the lungs, decreasing the air pressure from the outside. Air moves in, we oxygenate the blood, diaphragm pushes the lungs back up, and thus we exhale. Normal rate is about 14 to 20 breaths per minute. Coughing, hiccups, sneezing, and yawning can alter this rate. Thank you. I hope that you have enjoyed today's lesson. As you move to complete the work for this week, please refer back to this particular lesson, refer back to the interactions within the course, and you can also do your own individual research using the UMA library. Thank you.